I will be talking about how we could decolonize psychedelic-assisted therapy through a more relational, ethical approach in the clinic. So the aim of my talk is to first address how ethical issues are currently discussed and tackled in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. And I'm proposing that this is done mainly through mechanisms derived from established Western moral traditions and theories. Then I'll highlight that the discussion about ethics could serve as an entry point for a decolonizing lens by integrating indigenous ethics with a feminist ethics of care perspective. And in general, I'm asking the question what a decolonized understanding of caring could look like and offer for creating responsible relationalities in psychedelic psychotherapy. We know by now that psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy brings with it specific ethical issues. These have already been laid out and discussed for quite a while. So we know that there's in psychedelic states usually a loosening of boundaries that go along with ego dissolution, which leads to greater suggestibility and also vulnerability in these states. There's the possibility of a reenactment of traumatic experiences. There's the risk of intensified hierarchies in the therapy settings where therapists can be ascribed as a kind of a guru figure. And during the psychedelic experience, we usually also have impaired autonomy. So there's less a capacity for consent within these states. And especially with MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, we have increased feelings of connections and love, and these can also be exploited. So we have recently seen that abuses of power can, of course, happen in these states. By stories that have become public have shown that. So we really need to address these ethical issues specifically in the therapy settings here. And how that is tackled currently in the literature on the ethics in the psychedelic space is primarily through a bioethical lens. And bioethics, in short, addresses the perceived risks and benefits of novel biomedical interventions. And most commonly here, the four main bioethical principles are drawn upon that usually autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. And so far, autonomy is, I would say, the main principle here that's discussed. And autonomy is, generally, it's about providing choices and agency and decision-making for patients. And that's usually enabled through the process of informed consent in medical practice. And this whole approach that is very much focusing on principles is also called principalism. And this principalism, as discussed by Evans in this article, can be understood as a form of commensuration. So commensuration is the process of making things measurable by a common standard or metric. So these four principles of bioethics, they represent four different metrics. And in such an approach, what is happening is that information is put into these metrics. And so in this process, of course, there's information that's also ignored. And that's usually information that resists being translated and integrated in these metrics. So while such principles are useful because they enhance a calculability and can simplify decision-making in medicine, they also have their downsides. But in the current system we live in the biomedical system, they are very useful for decision makers because they have these very standardized rules that can be applied. But my point is that we also need to consider the limitations of such principle-based bioethics. It's a very simplified morality, to just put everything into these principles and see the world just through these principles. It's also very individualistic as an approach. Usually these bioethical dilemmas are located between the doctors and the patients. They are sidelining broader social and political dimensions, economic dimensions that also play a role. And yeah, they usually also do not address how group and social dynamics play a role and impact consent processes, for instance. Informed consent is probably the most used mechanisms in such a biomedical framework that we also have now discussed a lot and applied in the psychedelic therapy research and practice community. And informed consent, just for those who are not so much aware of what it is, it's about giving individuals to the degree, to their capability, the opportunity to choose what should or should not happen to them within a medical procedure. And this process is very much aligned with the two main Western ethical traditions, utilitarianism and deontology. And the argument coming from the utilitarian side, which is about utilitarianism, is about that the outcomes justify the means ethically. So here informed consent is understood to help prevent the harms by balancing risks and benefits. And that's the reason why it's supposed to be done. And from the second ethical tradition, deontology, which is more about that the duties matter more than the outcomes within such a medical process. So it's about the duty to respect the principle of autonomy of patients through informed consent procedures. And within psychedelic-assisted therapy settings, we see also special issues that come up in informed consent processes. First, it's necessary to explain to patients in advance that they will have often a difficult to explain, ineffable experience. And this has to be part of such a process. And then there's the risk of mental health issues also emerging, not just tackled, but also happening within the setting, like extreme anxiety, the risk of psychosis that also needs to be addressed. And a third point is with regard to the changes in values and personality and worldviews that is often the outcome of a psychedelic therapy setting. And I find it quite curious that in the literature, this is often on the ethics in psychedelic-assisted therapy, this is often understood as a risk of the therapy. But we could also ask ourselves, isn't that actually a central part of the treatment to have these changes happen? And finally, it's, of course, informed consent processes are about establishing treatment procedures. And here the main issue that is discussed at the moment is the use of therapeutic touch, because here boundary violations can have happened already. And here's the one argument is to have an enhanced consent process that then is also able to accommodate changes in preferences that can happen throughout the treatment and probably also during a psychotherapy session with the dosing. So these are issues that are currently discussed within the psychedelic therapy community. I want to switch now to the point about decolonizing, because all of these issues and the way these are tackled are very much rooted, as I said, in these very individualistic, traditional ethical theories. So how can we think towards decolonizing these therapy spaces? How can we do that? And I looked at this recently published article as an interesting example for how to bring a more traditional and indigenous perspective on ethics into psychedelic research and therapy. It's called Ethical Principles of Traditional Indigenous Medicine to Guide Western Psychedelic Research and Practice. And it's an interesting paper in the sense it's an outcome of a global process with different indigenous representatives from different nations. And in that process, they identified 8 interconnected ethical principles. You see them here in this list. And in general, these principles and their ideas are about providing guidelines to build respectful relationships between indigenous peoples and Westerners to uphold indigenous rights and also, with regards to their traditional knowledges and practices. So we could, I understand this whole process or what these authors are trying to do as a way of translating the indigenous ethics into the Western framework that is, as I said before, very much oriented around these principles. So these principles are not there in the indigenous knowledge systems. They are generated through this process to translate them to the Western framework, so to speak. So that can be critiqued, and I'm not going into the details of their proposals now, but what I still find in the paper really interesting and what I'm trying to take up in this presentation is that they are still able to focus on a central element that's, for me, beyond these more narrow principles, which is a general relational perspective that's common to indigenous ethical and ontological and epistemological approaches. So this is now, for those of you who have been in the previous part of the session, very much related to what we've heard from Susanna before about her anthropological research in Brazil, where she talked about the relational ontologies. So I'm looking at this more from the perspective of ethics, but it's quite similar in that sense. So in the sense that what is shared in different indigenous healing traditions is this focus on relationality that sees the self as relational and interconnected with all entities in the world, that acknowledges interdependency and responsibility for caring for interconnected life, what is often referred to as respect for Mother Earth. That includes all human and non-human and more than human relationships, and also the psychedelic medicines then. And this approach can, in general, be understood as a kin-centric approach versus an anthropocentric approach. So relationships are all are treated as kin, and it's also entangled with an agentic view of the non-human and more than human life. So plants or fungi are also related to as persons here. And it is here where I want to bridge to a Western ethical tradition that's been emerging just throughout the last few decades, the feminist ethics of care perspective. And I find this is a really nice connection here, because this ethics of care also challenges the dominant Western ethical theories and their overemphasis on reason and individuality. It's a relationship-based ethic that really starts from the reality that all beings need and receive care and give care to others. It's always about a context-sensitive response to a given situation. So care is understood as always situated. It's never about some abstract principles or universal standards, but very in the situation. And the basic assumptions of an ethics of care are very comparable to many of the assumptions of the indigenous ethics, understanding that human beings live in a web of mutual interdependencies, and that we need to consider the vulnerability of all affected and ensure that actions are in accordance with all the interests of the affected beings. A very common definition that's usually drawn upon in this literature is from Fisher and Tronto, that defines care as a species activity that includes everything that we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. That includes our bodies, ourselves, and our environment, all of which we seek to interweave in a complex, life-sustaining web. So this understanding of care really is about seeing that it's about relationships with and a recognition of others in these relationships as subjective beings and not just objects. And of course, this early ethics of care literature, like here Fisher and Tronto, is very much still rooted in a human-centric worldview. So it's not so much about the natural world or more than humans yet, but I come to that soon. But already from this start of the ethics of care literature, it was about really connection and understanding also care and as a process, so caring. And that this process is not just a unidirectional process and not just about the other, but it's also about the needs of both self and other, that really tries to take into account all the lived experiences of all the entities involved. And I also want to refer to three main authors now that I think really nicely illustrate the development in this type of literature and what it can bring also to help us bring the indigenous ethics and the ethics of care much closer together. So I start out with Joan Tronto's work on moral boundaries, this book where she defines or draws out 4 moral elements and 4 phases of care that she understands as necessary and building upon each other to enable good caring processes. So first, there's the element of attentiveness and the phase of caring about. So here you have to recognize others' needs and the need for care first. And then you come to the second phase of caring for, where it's about responsibility. So to take the responsibility to meet the identified need in this situation. And next, it's about caregiving then, about meeting their needs. And in order to do that, you have to be competent. You have to know how to take care. So like this mother here, she knows now how to take care of her child. It's crying and she nurtures it and goes outside. She could stay here. It would be totally fine for me. I wouldn't care. I care about it so much that she could stay here, but I also appreciate her going out now. So the fourth phase then is about care receiving. So we hear the child has stopped crying. It's back in the room now. It has received care. It's being nurtured. And I can see also the mother is responsive to the child and how the child is receiving the cares. So it's about the response of the care receiver in this last phase. And in order for care to really function properly, like we've seen in this example now with the mother and the baby, all these elements and phases need to be really fit together as a whole. And then we have integrity in a caring process. And since my background is in science, technology, and society studies, I now also want to mobilize a little bit more literature from that field. So here I'm referring to a book by the philosopher Annemarie Mohl, who has looked at caring relations that are enacted with a disease, in her case, diabetes. And she looks at how diabetes is done in a medical environment. And for her, in her observations and analysis, care is also seen as a very interactive and open-ended process. And the main point in her book is that she's distinguishing between a logic of care and a logic of choice that are both there in a medical situation, and that, of course, are in tension often. And the logic of choice, how she sees it, is very much part of the current more liberal, neoliberal world we live in, where it's about, the individual has the freedom to choose what they want, and they have also this burden on them. So this logic of choice that she describes, it rests on this right and freedom to choose. But the interesting thing to think about here is, I think, that the choice can also be negative in a way. It doesn't have to be good in itself. So when, for instance, is an overemphasis on choice becoming a problem? In which situations? When is it tricking us or patients? So I would like to also see here some more thinking about what choice means also in informed consent processes and in the psychedelic-assisted therapy settings. So to not just take choice as something that's good or positive in every situation of the treatment process, but to think about, which are the situations and where should choice matter, and where is probably a logic of care to be brought more to the forefront and a logic of choice to the background, for instance. And finally, I also think that it's now necessary, and as we've seen in the literature on the ethics of care, especially in Maria Puig de la Bella Casa's work on matters of care, that we move care towards the more than human and the non-human. So in her book, she's expanding human-centered care towards ecological care in order to enable non-exploitative coexistence in more than human webs. And it's an interesting approach because it also sees non-humans as equally caring. It's not just the humans who care. Care runs in all different directions. And she also troubles usually fixed categories and dichotomies that are understood as quite fixed. This is something that science and technology studies scholars love to do, to say that, for instance, the technological is not so separate from nature. And finally, she understands caring as a transformative ethos. So ethos here, a concrete way of living. So it's not a normative ethics, but the way of living is really the ground from which all moral behavior is coming from. And the principles are coming out of that. And the ethos is, so to speak, the more important element here. So coming to the end of my presentation, I'm trying to draw this all together, my critique of the more principle-based ethics, and now coming to what an ethics of care could add as a Western ethical framework, because it could allow us to open a space to really connect and dialogue with indigenous relational perspectives on ethics. And I think it can allow us to do it without engaging in like this unidirectional cultural appropriation, which I see currently a lot. It's about, let's integrate indigenous scholars, indigenous leaders and perspectives into the Western framework. So it's of course, it's good to invite them in, but I think we could also look like where can we from our own tradition, our own ethical and relational traditions meet the indigenous traditions halfway and really enter a dialogue and not also again replicate some exploitative tendencies here. So an integration of indigenous ethics with an ethics of care could lead perhaps to a broader decolonizing relational approach that then could serve as a counterpoint to the individualizing Western bioethical framework. I think it's important because it can provide much more complexity and nuance than what we see in principalism. And in this way, ethics can also be understood as not just an issue of choice, but of ongoing care. So that raises for me the question, when should care end in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy? So what would an ethics of care also look like that reaches beyond the end of treatment? I think this is a really important question, because we see now that although patients might feel often better after the therapy, it's usually not extremely long lasting, and there's a need for aftercare, so that care doesn't really stop at the end of the treatment. And like an ethics of care, I think, could be an avenue to really think towards these longer continuous care processes that we need to really establish well-being in our society. An ethics of care lens also, for me, shows the necessity of caring on different but entangled scales. So for me here, caring is on the internal or the intrapersonal. In the therapy setting, you like learn to care for yourself, for different parts in your own psyche. But then it's also the second level, the interpersonal. You learn that with the therapist, and then also in your relational environment, with your family and community. And the third step then is the international, of course, where we also should care about indigenous natures and cultures. So again, this caring beyond the clinic. And both as I said, the indigenous ethics and the ethics of care, as we see in these more recent developments, also share this stronger emphasis on the importance of caring for more than humans, which includes the medicines, spirits, the land and the soil where the medicines are coming from. A move towards a relational framework in psychedelic therapy is also a chance, I want to argue, towards a more preventative and maintenance-focused approach. So we still very much, we are stuck within a curative agenda by seeing, we want to cure people in these settings. But I think it's necessary in the long run to move out of that and also look at prevention. So in that sense, mental illness can be, I like to understand it as a breakdown of caring relations. So here again, it's about the continuous caring work that's necessary in order to prevent something from mental illness from happening, so to speak. And this then could also be an avenue to challenge dominant biomedical narratives that are still very common in psychiatry. So that it's not about imbalances in the brain, biochemical imbalances, but more about imbalances of relations that are actually at the basis of what produces these disorders, so to speak. And in this framing of relational ethics, it's also possible, I would say, to not see changes in worldviews and identity shifts as problematic in themselves, but to see them as changes in a relational web that have to be understood in this way. So it's not something that is in itself problematic then. And it's also here a potential to move us away from an individualistic narrative of personal transformation towards relational transformation, that it's not about healing individuals, but relationships in the end. And finally, let me finish with just saying that I think that if we become aware of that at the core of our existence and of well-being is that we are part of this complex web of interdependencies, this would also mean for me that the way we are doing psychedelic-assisted therapy takes this into account, so that we acknowledge more and put into practice the importance of group settings, and also enabling experiences where we can relate and be close to nature. So thank you so much.